All right, so we've been talking about social stratification. This is part two for that. Hopefully, it will let me go through the whole thing without stopping again. If not, I'll just do a part three. So we've been talking about social stratification, the layers, the categories in our society, income, wealth, status, power, and what plays in that. The inequalities of trying to distribute all of the resources that we have. We talked about, you know, what each social class was: upper class, middle class, lower class, the underclass. And if you remember in our activity or your discussion forum for the Titanic, we got to talking about how does your status, what's the life or death? Does it really matter? And that's kind of where we left off. So let's go back up here to health. What does health have to do with? Is it, a life or death situation? And it is. And so I think we left off talking about the upper and middle class live longer. They have better health care, better food, benefits. If you think about benefits in work, the upper class, middle class, that blue collar, they offer vacation, sick time. A lot of my friends who have that, they'll say, I'm taking a mental health day, and they still get paid for it. The lower middle class and the working class, they don't have the advantages of benefits, sick days. If they're sick, they lose pay. And so a lot of people will go in sick. And they're also in jobs that are less danger. It's not a lot of hands-on jobs, if you remember. Working class has less healthy food. I don't know if you've ever heard of Whole Foods, but a lot of people talk about it as whole paycheck. To eat healthy is expensive. But it's real cheap to go buy McDonald's or things like that, or buy, processed food. That's so much cheaper. And that is, fits into a lot of people's budget. But it's not healthy. And again, no health insurance with that. So that plays a big part. Another area is life expectancy. Again, you have higher risk jobs, more danger of getting hurt, construction, the hands-on, pulling out your back, hurting your knees. It's more physically demanding. And so the life expectancy is how many years you live. What life expectancy right now in our society is 80, 90 years, even in the 70s, 70s and 80s. And, middle and upper class are able to put their resources towards healthcare and better living conditions. This provides less stress in some people. Medication is very expensive. As you get older, you tend to be on more medication. I know some people whose medication is anywhere between $600 to $1,000 a month. If you don't have insurance, how are you going to pay for that? A lot of people in lower class don't have money left over for food, clothing, shelter, or medicines. I know a lot of people that without insurance, working minimum wage, they don't take their medicine that they're supposed to. They don't go to doctors. And of course, this leads to, a shorter life expectancy. Criminal justice is another area of inequalities. Lower class are much more likely to be victims of violent crimes. They're more likely to be suspected by the police and arrested. You have higher class individuals arrested for the same offenses. They're much more likely to be released without being charged. A perfect example is Britt Reed. He was assistant coach for Kansas City. Last week, a few days before the Super Bowl, he was in a car accident. He hit a family. The 5-year-old is still in life-threatening injuries. She's still in critical care. He admitted that he was drinking and driving, and he was not arrested. Why? Well, let's see. In a couple of days, he's needed. He was also arrested in Kansas City, right down the road from the stadium in Kansas City. He's getting ready to leave to go to the Super Bowl. Kansas City Chiefs were in the Super Bowl. And what they put out there was they're investigating the incident. I suspect that he'll be arrested this week, but they didn't want to do anything. Had that been anybody else, myself or anybody that didn't have that status, we would have been arrested right there on the spot for drinking and driving, a DUI. Lower class are less likely to be able to afford bail and lawyers, so they're spending their time in jail, even though they haven't been proven guilty. They're spending the time in jail until it can go to trial because they can't afford bail. More likely to be found guilty, the way you come into court, dressed as a defendant, being charged. You will see, I've seen on cop TV shows, and I've also been in the juvenile or the criminal justice system a lot. And those that come in that are better dressed, you think about the stereotypes. The jury is over there. If the person is dressed really nice, then that kind of sends a signal. Again, you look at symbolic interactionalisms, how we interact, clothing, symbols, and things like that. They're more likely to get a not guilty verdict. But those that are in lower class are probably coming in jumpsuits. They don't, the family's not able to bring in nice suits or nice dresses. And so there's a lot of inequalities with the social classes in the status. Education is another area. And we're going to do a whole topic on education, and we'll go more into this. But your schools, high schools, elementary schools, middle schools, are all funded locally through taxes. So how it works is the state gives you a certain amount per student, but then your local taxes help pay for education. So think about it. And again, you'll hear this again, but people of the same social classes tend to live near each other in groups and in communities. And so if you have upper and middle classes, if their taxes are paying for school, they have more resources. They also have the ability to send their children to college for higher education. The working classes in inner cities, again, a lot of poverty, not a lot of jobs. If the taxes are paying for that, they're not going to have the resources. They're not going to have laptops and higher technology. There's definitely a divide. And again, we'll talk about that when we get into the topic of education. Parenting. Parenting is very different based on social classes, status. Upper class, middle class. The parents are very involved and the children are involved in sports, play dates, parenting styles. Parents of middle and upper class, research has found that they talk through situations more. They teach creativity, and there's that expectation of higher education. Very different world. It's, again, go back to socialization that you just did last week. Parents are socializing their children to fit into that class, to understand the norms, behaviors, what's expected of them, preparing them for blue-collar management jobs. Whereas the working class has less time. Again, they can't leave to go to their kids' basketball game or sports in the middle of their job. They don't have that freedom. They don't have that time off. There's less time. They have to put in all this, 40 hours plus just to, pay the bills. Not enough money. If there's sports teams or travel teams, you have to buy all the equipment. There may not be money for that. Parenting styles, from what research has shown, is a hands-off. They're more focused on obedience and discipline. This goes right in line with some of the jobs that working class have. Um, you know, manufacturing. Everything is like, there's not a lot of creativity in that. And so parenting styles are very different from different classes. All right. So the American dream is, if you work hard enough, you will be able to reach your goals. Now, yes and no. Um, there's a lot of things that play into that. And so in our society, we have what's called an open class. There's also a closed caste system. And so in a closed caste system like India, and this has been in past, where you're born, that's where you stay. It's that ascribed status. You're born there, you're born into nobility. Um, you don't marry out of your social class. You don't go anywhere. There's no rise or fall. You're there. Open class is the United States. You are able to move up or move down. It's the ability to change positions within your social system. It's not a closed caste system. Somebody from a very wealthy family could marry somebody from a working class family. Look at, Prince Harry. He married a commoner. So it's in the open system, class system, you're able to move about. And there's a couple of terms for this. Upward mobility. Upward mobility happens. So if you have somebody who started working in the mailroom, and then after several years and going and getting an education and putting forth a lot of effort into the skills needed, and then they ended up being an assistant vice president, that's upward mobility. It is there. It takes other things. It takes higher education, working with a company and moving up. It also could be you were working at a convenience store and going to college. And then once you finished college with your degree, then you started working with your degree. Again, that's upward mobility. Now, downward mobility, of course, is exactly what it sounds like. Downward mobility is, and this happens a lot in layoffs. So if you have somebody working in upper management, and then there are a lot of economic problems going on, and there's layoffs, that person then is laid off and they're unemployed in a sense until they can find a job. If they're not able to find a job making the same income, let's say you had somebody working as a director at social services, and due to a lot of, and they were working in mental health, and due to a lot of economic problems, the Great Recession back in 2008 to 2014, they were laid off, couldn't find a job, so they started working as a cashier at a convenience store, going from $65,000, $70,000 a year to $825 an hour. That's definitely downward mobility. It happens. And so, and next week we'll be talking more about economy and work, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Intergenerational mobility, this is where you have a family of lower income, and then one of their children is the first to go to college, get an education. Now, getting an education is not the absolute of upward mobility, but it is a good part of that chance. So they go to college, and then they get a degree, and then they get hired in, and then they're in a management position. And so that's intergenerational. That's not where the family, you're just staying in lower class because your family has always been there, or working class. All right, so let's look at the big three that I like to call the big three, and that's the sociological perspectives on social stratification. Remember, it's functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionalism. So functionalism, and remember some of the names, Emile Durkheim. Um, Functionalism says we have to have different social classes. We have to have different status. That might be unequal. There might be inequalities, but we have to have it. Davis and Moore, Kingsley Davis and Wilbert Moore, we call it the Davis-Moore theory. And so their theory is the reason we have to have different social classes, the reason we have to have different income is certain tasks in society are more valuable than others. This is where you guys were deciding, and what many of you said you based your decision on, who lived on the Titanic and who did not get into the lifeboats. The more important work with higher levels of income, prestige, and power, it encourages people to work harder and longer. A degree of skill required for a job determines that job's importance, and more skill required for a job equals fewer qualified people for that job. So think about this. Every one of you picked a physician. The physician, to get to be a physician, whatever concentration you have, it takes a 4-year degree, then medical school, then residency. So you're looking at 8 to 10 years of money, work, studying, and learning all these skills to become a physician. And so Davis and Moore theory under functionalism says that they need to be paid more. There needs to be a higher status. How many of you all would go to medical school for 8 to 10 years and make the same pay of $15 an hour as the cashier or at McDonald's or office manager making $20 an hour? How many people would actually go and spend all that time? And so functionalism in the Davis-Moore theory is really pointing to, if we didn't reward people for learning these important skills, then there would be nobody to do it. And so we have to have different powers. We need to give them a different status and prestige. Now, conflict theory, and I talked earlier about conflict theory, there's a lot of inequalities. Conflict theorists would look at social stratification, and they are very deeply critical of social stratification and the categories. It brings benefits to only some people and not all of society. Example, professional basketball player. Well, what do they really do? They're making millions of dollars, but what are they doing? For a little while, they're entertaining you. Now, it does take a skill set. You have to be really good to become a professional basketball player. But really, what are they contributing to society? Based as a school teacher. School teachers, believe it or not, in North Carolina, high school, middle school, elementary schools, teachers start off at $32,000, $33,000 a year. They spend a lot of their own money on supplies. They spend a lot more hours of work than a professional basketball player. Not training, and they do put in a lot of exercise and training. But yet we give a higher status. We would push over a school teacher out of the way to go get an autograph of a famous or professional basketball player. But the basketball players wouldn't be where they are if it wasn't for the school teachers. And so, there's a lot of inequalities there that conflict theorists want to look at. And social classes continue to perpetuate inequality. How is that? Go back to family and parenting. It is passed on from generation to generation. You were socialized for your social class. And again, with social class and status, it just kind of encourages more of the inequalities. Um, Look at how rich a society, how can a rich society, America is very, very wealthy, but we have so many poor members. That money in the status is not going back into the community, it's going back into the community of each social class. So if there's not much in that society or that community to begin with, how is more going to go into it? And so that cycle just continues. Again, if you go back to uh, health insurance, if you go back to criminal justice, it just continues to cycle that way. Now, a symbolic interactionalist would look at the interactions day to day, face to face of social classes and the meanings that people are giving out. Um, how does your social standing affect your everyday interactions? Research shows that people will interact primarily with others who share the same social standing, because not only is it the same social standing, it's the same norms, values, and beliefs. And so people tend to live, work, and associate with others like themselves. They go to dinner parties or they're hanging out at the campfire. Um, it's not the rule of all, but this is what happens. They live. If let's say the CEO of Lowe's Corporation, could you see him living in a manufactured home in a small development? No, most likely. Now, I do know, I will tell you, the one of the uh, things that break this, I don't know if you guys know, or hopefully you do, Dale Earnhardt Jr. Dale Earnhardt Jr. lives in a kind of like a double wide manufactured home out in the middle of the country. He is actually, this is Dale Earnhardt, famous NASCAR driver's son. And Dale has money and he has status, but he shops at the local Food Lion. Um, just, down to earth guy. And that's not, you would think, a lot, Jeff Gordon, another famous race car driver. He has this big mansion on Lake Norman on the lake, as do a lot of other drivers. But here you've got Dale Earnhardt Jr. He lives on a farm, a couple of cows, all this status. So again, he kind of goes back to his roots. He doesn't follow that norm, but most people do. You can look at the different housing developments, and people in those housing developments pretty much have the same social class, same norms, same values. Symbolic interactionalists look at that. Social class also groups people together. The other thing that symbolic interactionalists would look at too is, what meanings do we have for different material cultures, such as the large houses, the clothing, Louis Vuitton, and Coach purses, and then you look at the Mercedes and the BMWs. Now, really, a shirt is a shirt. What's a shirt for? A shirt is to provide coverage and comfort and protection. Same with shoes. Car. Why do we drive a car? We drive a car to get from one place to the other. So, it wouldn't matter, in a sense, what kind of car you were driving. But in social classes, that's an importance. That's that way, just like we were talking back in socialization, parents dress up their children in colors, babies, in pink or blue or ribbons to show to the world, that this is a little girl or this is a little boy. Same with social classes, and especially upper and middle. Conspicuous consumption also goes with that, and with symbolic interactionalism. We're symbolically communicating that social standing. And again, you might purchase certain products to make a social statement. So that what I was talking about is called conspicuous consumption. All right, so we have social stratification here all around the world in all societies, but then there's global stratification. So now we're not just talking about communities and society. We're talking about the world and the inequality. So while stratification in the United States refers to the unequal distribution among individuals, global stratification is the unequal distribution among the nations. There's economic inequality. So compare United States average wage to world average wage. United States, $8.25 for the minimum wage is very high. That's a lot of money. We're a very wealthy state. We just don't really, a lot of people don't understand that. There's a lot of prejudice and discrimination, whether against a certain race, ethnicity, religion, or the like. And it can create and aggravate conditions of economic equality. For example, apartheid. In South Africa, it's not there. The minority group, the lower number of people were the whites, but they had more power. There's a lot of gender inequality through the world. United States, even though women are, and we'll talk about this in gender and sexuality, but women are, are kind of on the lower rung in here in the United States, but we have a lot more freedom and power than many women throughout the world. And also sexual orientation and gender identity. There's a lot of issues with that throughout the world. So, have you ever heard of the term third world country? Sociologists have found that comes from, it's kind of more of a derogatory term. And so they've come up with some new terms. Instead of the first world, second world, third world, they talk about core nations. This is global classification. So just like we have upper class, middle class, lower class, we have core nations. That's the dominant capitalist countries. United States, Great Britain, the UK, Germany, Sweden, Japan. These are all wealthy states. And then you have what's called peripheral nations, and this used to be the term for third world country. Very limited industrialization, unstable governments, Cuba, Vietnam, Haiti. And then you have semi-peripheral. That's kind of like your middle class. So the core nations is your more upper class, peripheral nations are your lower class. And then semi-peripheral are in-between nations. They're not really powerful enough to dictate policy, like the United States, UK, Germany, but they do act as a major source for material. Mexico would be one of the semi-peripheral nations. So I mentioned earlier, one of the things for Karl Marx talked about in his two classes, he had the owners, the dominant group, and the subordinate group. And I talked about how capitalists when they're competing each other, they have to be able to compete, and they will cut wages. They want to make more profit. Well, this is where outsourcing comes from. So they cut people, they cut wages. This is happening a lot. If you go into Walmart now, you have a lot of self-checkouts. So you have 15 little registers there and one person taking care of that. That's 15 people's jobs right there. Now that you go into McDonald's, you order on a screen. They're cutting back. This is, what's happening into our society. And then there's a lot of outsourcing, meaning it's going out of the country. A lot of our factories, or a lot of our manufacturers, a lot of things, if you go through your house and everything that says made in China and you move it to the backyard, you're not going to have much left in your house. So we are outsourcing ourselves out of jobs. Online ordering, tech support. When you call customer service, you're not calling anybody in the United States, even though they will say their name is Tom, Jerry, Harry, or whatever. They are not. Even phone lines are being, call-in services are being outsourced to other countries. Clothing. Believe it or not, I went to Red Robin. I used to eat at Red Robin a lot. And I did a call-in order, and I did it over the phone. And the guy had a hard time understanding me, what I wanted, but I didn't think anything of it. And then I went and picked up my order, and it was completely wrong. And so I talked to the manager, and I was like, hey, I called in this order, and it's not even close to what I ordered. And he says, well, I'm not really supposed to tell people this, but when you call in and if you don't hit the button that comes directly to our store, the order actually goes to India. And then they type it into a computer that will go to the cooks on the line. Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Why are you going to have somebody who takes an order and then sends it to the computer in, let's say, Mooresville, North Carolina, and somebody who took the order was in India? Again, it's outsourcing. They're not just doing it for that store. Any calls that they're getting, and again, it's cutting wages. So this is what's going on. There's a capital fight with outsourcing. Now, I want to go back to, America is very wealthy. We are a corn nation. We are much wealthier than a lot of nations. But you hear a lot of people say that they're poor. Well, what does it really mean to be poor? Is it a single mother with 2 kids in Charlotte waiting for the next paycheck? Does it mean living with almost no furniture in your apartment because your income doesn't allow for extras? Does it mean having to live with the distended bellies of the chronically malnourished in the peripheral nations? You might feel like you're poor if you can't afford cable television or buy your own car, or you see somebody else with a nice laptop or Apple iPad or the new smartphone, and you can't keep up. But somebody else might look at you and look at the clothes you wear and the calories you get and say, man, you are rich. And so we have a different view. And sociologists look at this. So we have a couple of terms. You need to know these terms. So relative poor. Relative poor it's where people can afford necessities. They have bathroom, they have a shelter, they have food, they have clean water. But they're not able to meet the society's average standard of living. So let's go back to that standard of living, that comfort. You may not have a 65-inch screen TV. You may not have the new iPhone, but you do have your necessities. That's being met. Keeping up with the Joneses, that idea that you have to keep up with the neighbor's standard of living to not feel deprived. We in America fool ourselves. Well, I must be poor. It's true, you might feel poor. You might not have a car to drive to and from work. You might not be, like everybody else. And you might not have any extras beyond just making ends meet. But that's relative poor. Absolute poor it's the other side. People live in absolute poverty throughout the world. And then there are some absolute poverty and absolute poor in the United States. Very, very few. It's lacking even the basic necessities. Adequate food, clean water, safe housing, access to health care. Now, even our homeless, those that live on the streets that are homeless, do have access to food. There's a lot of food banks. There's a lot of people helping with that. And so they're not going completely without food. Clean water. It may be more difficult there, but there are shelters out there willing to help. And then healthcare, there are fundings for that. Throughout the world, many countries live on $1.25 a day. In your reading segments, one of the things that is talked about is outsourcing, the Nike sweatshops, and I gave you both sides. And then looking at what their life is like on $1.25 a day. Yeah, what happened was it became, minimum wage went up to $8.25, and companies wanted more profit, so they moved it out of the country, and now they can pay people $1.25 a day instead of $8.25 an hour and end up with more profits. Now, subjective poor is how you see yourself. It's, in Haiti, a family may make $100 a month, which is actually stretching it. When I lived in Haiti, if you were a cook, you could earn, and this was a long time ago, so it's probably went up, but maybe not. I haven't been there in a long time. But a cook could only make $8 a month. But, if they're making, if you have a cook making $8 a month, they may feel like they're doing really well. But if you go to visit Haiti and look around, you're going to see them as poor. And so it's subjective. Where do you see yourself? All right. So for your assignment, for your discussion post this week, your forum, your assignment is to look at your social class. I also want you to look at your status, those roles, student, employee. Where are you at in that? Are you a manager at a if you're working? Your gender, prestige, family's income, and you also definitely want to look at family because a lot of you aren't living on your own yet. But I want you to look at your social class and kind of your corners of your world that you maintain. And I want you to look at the advantages and the disadvantages. And then also research. You need to be researching on social classes. What about disadvantages and advantages of other social classes? It's all kind of put in there, so make sure you're following the instructions on that. You also have a budget activity for practical exercise. I want you to follow the budget, make a budget for a person with minimum wage. The instructions are on there. You're going to need that budget for your discussion forum next week when we do work and economy. All right, so I hope that you guys got some information from this lecture. If you have any questions, don't forget to use the muddiest point or send me an email. I'd be happy to clarify anything that I missed or wasn't clear on. So I hope you guys have a great rest of the week, and I will see you next week.